One of the very popular ways to structure a neural network is called a convolutional neural network. It was invented by my good friend Jan LeCun about 30 years ago, but it's become incredibly popular for things like image processing and processing large data sets. So let's talk about convolutional neural networks.
So far, we've talked about neural networks in general, but if you know something about your data, for example, if it's an image or a sequence of things, you can do a lot better. The idea is very simple. If your data has some structure and your network doesn't have to learn that structure from scratch, it's going to perform better. Imagine, for example, that you're trying to classify those letters, and you know that color is really not a factor in what makes an A an A. What do you think would be easier for your classifier to learn? A model that uses the color image, or a model that only looks at the grayscale? Here's another example. You have an image, and you want your network to say, it's an image with a cat in it. It doesn't really matter whether cat is. It's still an image with a cat. If your network has to learn about kittens in the left corner and about kittens in the right corner independently, that's a lot of work that it has to do. How about you telling it instead explicitly that objects in images are largely the same whether they're on the left or on the right of the picture? That's what's called translation invariance. Different positions, same kitten. Yet another example. Imagine you have a long text that talks about kittens. Does the meaning of kitten change depending on whether it's in the first sentence or in the second one? Mostly not. So if you train a network on text, maybe you want the part of the network that learns what a kitten is to be reused every time you see the word kitten and not have to relearn it every time. The way you achieve this in neural networks is using what's called weight sharing. When you know that two inputs can contain the same kind of information, then you share their weights and train the weights jointly for those inputs. It's a very important idea. Statistical invariance, things that don't change on average across time or space, are everywhere. For images, the idea of weight sharing will get us to study convolutional networks. For text and sequences in general, it will lead us to embeddings and recurrent neural networks. Let's talk about convolutional networks, or ConvNets. Let's talk about convolutional networks, or ConvNets. ConvNets are neural networks that share their parameters across space. Imagine you have an image. It can be represented as a flat pancake. It has a width, a height, and because you typically have red, green, and blue channels, it also has a depth. In this instance, depth is 3. That's your input. Now imagine taking a small patch of this image and running a tiny neural network on it with, say, k outputs. Let's represent those outputs vertically in a tiny column like this. Now let's slide that little neural network across the image without changing the weights. Just slide across and vertically like we're painting it with a brush. On the output, we've drawn another image. It's got a different width, a different height, and more importantly, it's got a different depth. Instead of just R, G, and B, now you have an output that's got many color channels, k of them. This operation is called a convolution. If your patch size were the size of the whole image, it would be no different than a regular layer of a neural network. But because we have this small patch instead, we have many fewer weights, and they are shared across space. A ConvNet is going to basically be a deep network where instead of having stacks of matrix multiply layers, we're going to have stacks of convolutions. The general idea is that they will form a pyramid. At the bottom, you have this big image but very shallow, just R, G, and B. You're going to apply convolutions that are going to progressively squeeze the spatial dimensions while increasing the depth, which corresponds roughly to the semantic complexity of your representation. At the top, you can put your classifier. You have a representation where all the spatial information has been squeezed out and only parameters that map to content of the image remain. So that's the general idea. If you're going to implement this, there are lots of little details to get right and a fair bit of lingo to get used to. You've met the concept of patch and depth. Patches are sometimes called kernels. Each pancake in your stack is called a feature map. Here you're mapping 3 feature maps to k feature maps. Another term that you need to know is stride. It's the number of pixels that you're shifting each time you move your filter. A stride of 1 makes the output roughly the same size as the input. A stride of 2 means it's about half the size. I say roughly because it depends a bit about what you do at the edge of your image. Either you don't go past the edge, and it's often called valid padding as a shortcut, or you go off the edge and pad with zeros, in such a way that the output map size is exactly the same size as the input map. That is often called same padding as a shortcut. By 28 image. You run a 3x3 convolution on it with an input depth of 3 and an output depth of 8. What are the dimensions of your output feature maps? When you're using same padding with a stride of 1, when you're using valid padding with a stride of 1, and when you're using valid padding with a stride of 2. If you're using the so-called same padding in a stride of 1, the output width and height are the same as the input. We just add zeros to the input image to make the sizes match. If you use the so-called valid padding in a stride of 1, then there is no padding at all. So if you want to fit your little filter on the input image without doing any padding, you're going to have to remove 1 row and 1 column of the image on each side. So you're left with 26 features in each of the maps at the output. If in addition you use a stride of 2, then you only get half as many outputs, so 13 in width and 13 in height. In all cases, the output depth isn't changed. That's it. You can build a simple ConvNet with just this. Stack up your convolutions, which thankfully you don't have to implement yourselves. Then use strides to reduce the dimensionality and increase the depth of your network layer after layer. And once you have a deep and narrow representation, connect the whole thing to a few regular fully connected layers, and you're ready to train your classifier. You might wonder what happens to training, and to the chain rule in particular, when you use shared weights like this. Nothing really happens. The math just works. You just add up the derivatives for all the possible locations on the image. Now that you've seen what a simple ConvNet looks like, there are many things that we can do to improve it. We're going to talk about 3 of them: pooling, one-by-one convolutions, and something a bit more advanced called the Inception architecture. The first improvement is a better way to reduce the spatial extent of your feature maps in the convolutional pyramid. Until now, we've used striding to shift the filters by a few pixels each time and reduce the feature map size. This is a very aggressive way to downsample an image. It removes a lot of information. What if instead of skipping 1 in every 2 convolutions, we still ran with a very small stride, say for example 1, but then took all the convolutions in a neighborhood and combined them somehow? That operation is called pooling, and there are a few ways to go about it. The most common is max pooling. At every point on the feature map, look at a small neighborhood around that point and compute the maximum of all the responses around it. There are some advantages to using max pooling. First, it doesn't add to your number of parameters, so you don't risk an increase in overfitting. Second, it simply often yields more accurate models. However, since the convolutions that run below run at a lower stride, the model then becomes a lot more expensive to compute. And now you have even more hyperparameters to worry about: the pooling region size and the pooling stride. And no, they don't have to be the same. A very typical architecture for a convnet is a few layers alternating convolutions and max pooling, followed by a few fully connected layers at the top. The first famous model to use this architecture was the Net 5, designed by Jan LeCun to do character recognition back in 1998. Modern convolutional networks such as AlexNet, which famously won the competitive ImageNet Object Recognition Challenge in 2012, used a very similar architecture with a few wrinkles. Another notable form of pooling is average pooling. Instead of taking the max, just take an average over the window of pixels around a specific location. It's a little bit like providing a blurred, low-resolution view of the feature map below. We're going to take advantage of that shortly. But first, I want to introduce you to another idea. It's the idea of one-by-one convolutions. You might wonder, why would one ever want to use one-by-one convolutions? They're not really looking at a patch of the image, just at one pixel. Look at the classic convolution setting. It's basically a small classifier for a patch of the image, but it's only a linear classifier. But if you add a one-by-one convolution in the middle, suddenly you have a mini neural network running over the patch instead of a linear classifier. Interspersing your convolutions with one-by-one convolutions is a very inexpensive way to make your models deeper and have more parameters without completely changing their structure. They're also very cheap, because if you go through the math, they're not really convolutions at all. They're really just matrix multiplies, and they have relatively few parameters. I mention all of this, average pooling and one-by-one convolutions, because I want to talk about a general strategy that has been very successful at creating convnets that are both smaller and better than convnets that simply use a pyramid of convolutions. It's called an Inception Module. It's going to look a little more complicated, and you can skip this section if you'd like. It's not essential to the rest of the lecture. The idea is that at each layer of your convnet, you can make a choice. Have a pooling operation, have a convolution, and then you need to decide, is it a 1-by-1 convolution, or a 3-by-3, or a 5-by-5? All of these are actually beneficial to the modeling power of your network. So why choose? Let's use them all. Here's what an Inception module looks like. Instead of having a single convolution, you have a composition of average pooling followed by a 1-by-1, then a 1-by-1 convolution, then a 1-by-1 followed by a 3-by-3, then a 1-by-1 followed by a 5-by-5. And at the top, you simply concatenate the output of each of them. It looks complicated, but what's interesting is that you can choose these parameters in such a way that the total number of parameters in your model is very small, yet the model performs better than if you had a simple convolution.